I'm Jonathan. I'm 8 years old. If I get a cut, I don't stop bleeding.
We first realized there was a problem with Jonathan when he was a week old and he was circumcised and he didn't stop bleeding. Sick Kids did a blood test on Jonathan and the results were that he was a hemophiliac. Both my boys are severe hemophiliacs.
We don't have this stuff in our body to clot our blood.
If my sons get a cut, they won't stop bleeding without pressure or their medicine. If they get a bruise, it's worse than other little kids. It's much bigger. They also get what you call joint bleeds inside the skin, underneath the skin, in the joints. The anxiety for me when Jonathan was a baby was a lot more than it is now. He would be climbing stairs and he'd slip and I'd go, now it's, oh, okay, just keep going. Jonathan knows he is a hemophiliac and he knows that that means that he bleeds and he does not stop bleeding.
If I have a loose tooth, I need to be careful eating and when I'm riding my bike and being careful when I go to my friend's house.
For Matthew, for me to turn around and say to him, slow down. I don't think he knows why I'm saying it. He doesn't always listen, but we try and tell him why we're telling him. Hopefully one day he'll know what we're talking about. I hate needles to begin with, so it's very hard to try and give your own child a needle. But he is a pro. I'm very proud of him. I would not be able to do this every other day. Arms are dirty, man. The reason we give the boys their needles is to give them their factor VIII, which they're missing in their blood, to help them clot. Get your breakfast, buddy. Matthew's needle, it's a little different from Jonathan's because he has the port. It has to be sterile. I need somebody to hold Matthew because he will squirm. Okay, sit back. And then we have to count. I don't like to see my sons in pain. I think that's what upsets me the most. 1, 2, 3. Well done.
Okay. When we were thinking about having Matthew for another child, we knew what to expect just from what Jonathan went through.
Having 2 boys with hemophilia, I think consumes most of my life with keeping up with the data of all their medicine, ordering the supplies and the medicine, and basically just watching and making sure they're okay.
It's actually made us grow closer together because we have to basically have to work together to agree with what they can and can't do. We have to deal with a lot of things, stressful things when problems arise, but as far as a couple, I think we've grown closer together.
Jonathan is different from other children because he can't play contact sports, so he doesn't get to always participate in things that other kids are doing. We don't put our boys in a bubble, we let them be free. My hopes for the future for the boys is maybe they'll come up with one last shot that the boys would have and it would basically be a cure for the rest of their life. They wouldn't have to give themselves needles every day. I don't want to see my sons having to go through that all their life.
Hematologist Manuel Carqueo is here to explain hemophilia. Thank you so much for being here. What do we know about hemophilia right now? What is it exactly?
Well, hemophilia is a genetic bleeding disorder that affects primarily only boys or men.
Why is that?
Well, it's because it's a genetic disorder that's where the gene for hemophilia is on the X chromosome. Women have 2 X chromosomes. Men only have 1 X chromosome. So it's very unlikely that a woman would have both genes on each of those X chromosomes affected, whereas for a man, it's much more likely that one of those X chromosomes can be affected.
Right. What causes it? Do we know?
Well, we know that hemophilia has been around for thousands of years. Yes. It is a genetic disorder, and it's caused by changes in the gene for factor. And we need factor. There's different types of factor, but we need factor in order to allow us to form a proper blood clot and to stop bleeding. So people have these genetic changes on these genes, and they can be transferred from one parent to a child.
Can you see it in utero? Or do you not know until
No, you can actually test in utero. To do so, you have to determine what the genetic change is within the family. But once you know that, you can then test a pregnancy and determine if the child is affected or not.
Are there different types and degrees of hemophilia?
Yeah, there are essentially 2 types. And it's actually quite simple because it's hemophilia A or hemophilia B. So that's pretty simple. And then it comes in either severe or moderate or a mild form.
So what kind of so let's take moderate. What kind of hit does a child have to have, or a person, I guess, because I don't know if you grow out of it, but have to sustain a bad bruise or to start bleeding?
Yeah. Well, 2 things to that. First, you don't grow out of it. It is a lifelong condition. You have it from the first day you're born, and you have it until the last day of your life. In terms of, there's a big difference between moderate and severe hemophilia. Severe is much, much worse than moderate hemophilia. But a child that has moderate hemophilia, if they were to sustain a hockey stick, for example, hitting them in the leg,
right.
Whereas I or you would have a little bruise, they would have a very large, deep bruise that not only would you see, because most bruises you can see, but you would actually feel it. It would be a lump on the area.
Is that life-threatening?
No, that by itself wouldn't be life-threatening. It would cause pain, but it wouldn't be life-threatening. More typical is that they would get bleeds into their joints, so particularly the knees, the ankles, and the elbows. And although each of those bleeds is not necessarily life-threatening, children with hemophilia will have many and many of these bleeds. So they may have 5, 10, 15, 30 bleeds every year. So by the time that they're a teenager, they've had hundreds of bleeds into some of these joints, and essentially they've damaged their joints to the point where they're going to be completely crippled.
What's the average age of diagnosis? This kid was obviously diagnosed in the first week, but sometimes it doesn't come up until they're quite a bit older, right?
Sure. So the second child in a family is usually diagnosed right away because you suspect it and you test. But the first child in a family where there is no one else with hemophilia, usually at around 1 year or 2 years of age. And often it's because the child has been having many different bleeds and has, in many cases, been going to emergency departments, and doctors don't necessarily make the diagnosis right away because it is a relatively rare condition. So often it's after some period of time that you'll make the diagnosis.
So toddlers, when they're first starting to walk and they're first starting to fall down, that would be a common time.
That's the typical age, because until then, children aren't doing that much that would cause them to have any bleeding.
How close are we to a cure?
Well, it depends what you mean by cured. This is a genetic condition, and it's unlikely that we will simply eradicate hemophilia. Hemophilia will continue, but in terms of where we are now, as opposed to 30, 40 years ago, we've made tremendous progress.
So it's very manageable.
Very, very manageable. And people with hemophilia are now living until their 60s and 70s and 80s.